Hi, how's everyone doing? Good, nice, warm reception. So you said my name is Max. I'm a PhD candidate at School of Planning. So I don't come from a more aging or applied health background, but I think the interplay between planning and aging is so important, and it's still pretty understudied. Specifically, my research is in shrinking cities, is what I'm interested in. And so before we go, I have a question for you. What do you think a shrinking city is, or can you name one, or what do you think I'm talking about? Perfect. The poster child of shrinking cities, yeah. Has anyone been to Detroit? If anyone wants tourism tips, Detroit's actually really nice. It's really cool. And so I love Detroit. So yeah, so what about Detroit makes it a shrinking city? Yeah, so if you hit the two things. So the main thing we talk about is population loss, but the second one is some kind of economic change, economic decline, economic restructuring. So with this in mind, my interest is a bit more on the demographic side of things, and since we're talking about aging populations, I'm going to talk about that today. So generally, populations change because you have, people are born, people die, and across a lot of the industrialized world and a lot of Canada, as we know, birth rates are going down. And when birth rates go down, then your age cohort structures move along. All of a sudden, you have more deaths than you have births. And if you look at Japan, who's expected to lose like another 27 million people in the next 20 years, I think, it can get really drastic, and it really changes how you plan for cities, how cities exist, and how cities work. And so you end up losing population. A lot of places in Canada, especially southern Ontario, you see migration offsets this. So you have people come in from all over the world, all over the country, and they offset this lack of births within our actual natural population. But we sometimes forget in planning, we focus so much on these types of cities that a lot of places have migration leaving as well. So say you're like from Nova Scotia, as some people, I'm from Nova Scotia, and we don't really have that much in-migration to Nova Scotia. People aren't dying to get to Sydney anymore. And you also have people like me who leave for the fair, prosperous lands of Ontario and BC and America and such. And so we get this loss of population from migration as well. So in this case, we really have the aging population is compounding this already existing trend of migration. And so this makes a lot of problems. So today I'm going to talk about a tiny sliver of my dissertation. And if anyone has any more questions about it or outside of this, or more complex questions, feel free to talk to me. I can share any papers or anything like that, or just tourism tips for shrinking cities. I've been from anywhere from New Orleans to Detroit to Charleroi to Leipzig in Germany. So if anyone wants to go shrinking cities tours, you can talk to me. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to illustrate the complexity of the urban shrinkage process, and then kind of zoom in on the aging component. So really what I'm interested in is telling stories. What happens in a shrinking city? You said here, the jobs are lost and people leave, there's this evacuation. And so that's the general idea we have, is this linear narrative that the economy changes, jobs are lost, people leave. So I think it's a bit more complicated than that. And so that's what I was interested in doing, is kind of unpacking these processes. And so in that first example, we talked about migration, population, births, and deaths. So it's like 4 different variables. So what I did in my research, one part of it, is I looked at a complex system of 15 variables from the built environment, from demographics, from migration, and from the economy, and to see what kind of story is there, what happens over time in different cities, and how does this manifest in shrinkage. And so I'm looking at the relative strength, timing, and direction. So I looked at 2 communities from 1997 to 2013. I'll concentrate on beautiful Chatham-Kent. For those of you who don't know where Chatham-Kent is, it's in southern Ontario, near Windsor, near Detroit. The only place in the country, I think, where you go south to north. You go from north to south to come into Canada from Detroit. Interesting fact for you. And so what I was looking at is cross-correlation coefficients between pairwise relationships between the 15 variables. Kind of briefly over this, but just to note what I mean, is correlations is basically how closely 2 trends are together, right? And so if these were on top of each other, they'd be perfectly correlated. So what cross-correlations look at is try to capture this lag. If there's a recurring trend over time, but there's a lag between it, so say, economy changes, people leave. I'm trying to capture that story over time, what happens. So I'll give you some results on the next slide. I'm going to warn you, don't feel you need to focus too hard on it. It's a bit extreme. It's the 15 variables and all the significant relationships I found between them. So this is what happens in Chatham-Kent. So I stared at this for many, many hours. So each of these is a connection that has a lag to it, and saying one thing changes, then the other changes. So we've got our 15 variables. Red means it's an inverse or negative relationship. Black means positive. So we don't need to focus too much on this, but you just get an idea that it's very complex, and it's just with 15 variables to see. The idea is can we pull out what happens? But what I'm going to do now is concentrate on the aging portion of this. So when I'm saying aging, I'm talking about how this is defined normally, but in demographics, sometimes people over 65. So here are 4 of the relationships that have to do with aging in the city. Thank you. And as you can see, all of them are red. That means it's an inverse relationship. As they get older, the other things are going down. And it's actually, there is no lag in all these. It has an arrow around it because it's reciprocal. So it means that as one changes, the other changes in tandem. So for example, in the top one, we say, okay, in Chatham-Kent, the population of people over 65 goes up, and immigration is going down. So can anyone think of an idea of why that might happen? If you were trying to tell a story around these 2 things, the community is getting older, less people are moving from overseas into it. It's okay if not, but any ideas? I actually really like the awkward silence when you ask a question. You know, I taught him earlier a couple of years ago. I do it all the time in a class with like 400 people. So one thing, I mean, it could be, okay, maybe something about what's happening in the community that's making it become an aging community also can be something that is making it less interesting or less attractive to people coming from overseas. And same goes, okay, if we look at the third one here, okay, the community ages and employment goes down. And this could be as simple as people are just retiring and they're not having new jobs that are replacing them. And so I was taking a lot of these different pieces of stories and trying to put them together to say, okay, what's happening? So why does this matter to some extent? Well, as I said before, this change in population and aging really compounds ongoing trends that are happening in shrinking cities. So we see that population loss can become a lot worse, and it can really unbalance the workforce, what's happening there. And then the crux really of shrinking cities research is this middle point right here, so the increased need for services. So we can talk about services just as like transportation, sewer, water. You have the same footprint. So if you take Detroit, it's this huge, massive city. You can fit Boston, San Francisco, and Manhattan in Detroit. Yet it has the whole area as big as San Francisco is completely empty. But you still have the services if there's people there, but you have a declining tax base because people are leaving. So you have the same amount of costs, except you have less money. And in fact, once you have a more vulnerable population, because it's often affluent people who are leaving, or an aging population, they actually need more services in terms of social services. So this is the big conundrum in shrinking cities. And I said there's an influence as well from some of the results I showed about immigration and employment and housing. So then I always like to ask students this question, and I've asked me a lot of times. The big question is, so what? Like, who cares? Everyone planning really wants to concentrate on talking about San Francisco or Toronto or Vancouver or New York. And I think this is really important, especially in terms of the aging. So 2 big picture takeaways from my dissertation are that decision makers need to act small. So they need to be realistic. I forget if I stole the quote, if I made it up. I like to think I made it up. But decision makers need to make decisions for the population they have, not the population they want. So you see people chasing, building a new casino or rec center. It's like, that's a lot of money. Why are you doing that? And they're chasing smokestacks. And so the biggest advice I have, and coming from a dissertation, is be realistic about your population and demography of it. And concentrate on quality of life rather than trying to attract people. You need to concentrate on the people who are actually there. And the second one is decision makers should think big. And not in terms, again, of making a new casino. But you have limited resources, so collaborate with other cities and towns and coordinate with higher levels of government. So someone in isolation, Detroit's another, they're easy to pick on, but Michigan's a pretty rich state, actually, in parts of it, and has some of the richest suburbs in the entire country, right outside Detroit. But there's no coordination, no collaboration. There's a lot of racial tension that has to do with that historically. But you have to have this coordination, where if you look in Germany, they have usually help from the region, from the state, and from the EU as well. So they can do a lot more and coordinate and spend their money the best way they can rather than wasting it. So again, chasing smokestacks or chasing dreams that won't ever happen. And one thing that's come up, I have 30 seconds left, that I found was interesting, looking at smaller populations and smaller areas and aging, is how they're spending their money. And one big thing that came up, which is kind of close to my heart, I guess, is looking at rinks. So if you have an aging population, it's so expensive. I was looking in Sydney, Nova Scotia, to keep running this rink, but it's such a big part of Canadian culture and a big part of it, something that's really hard for people to lose. But at the same time, if almost all of your population is like 40 and above, that's a huge cost for a city that doesn't have any money to even provide, road services or sewer or anything else. And so that's one conversation I think is really interesting that I haven't seen that much about in terms of how, so the recreation side of it. from the city planning municipal part of it that I think is really interesting. I think there needs to be a lot more research on shrinking cities. It's growing around the world. Detroit helped a lot. And in Europe, it's growing quite a bit. In Canada, no one still really cares. You keep telling me, it's such a small percent of the population. Toronto's growing, the country as a whole is growing, then why does it matter? And I argue it's still millions of people who live in the periphery and live in Nova Scotia and Northern Ontario, and that I think it's really important. I think there's a lot of room for overlap in aging research, and I think I'm at time. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.